Chapter 6 of The Princess Casamassima by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. One day, shortly after this, at the bindery, his friend Poupin was absent, and sent no explanation, as was customary in case of illness or domestic accident. There were 2 or 3 men employed in the place, whose non-appearance, usually following close upon pay-day, was better unexplained, and was an implication of moral feebleness. But as a general thing, Mr. Crookenden's establishment was a haunt of punctuality and sobriety. Least of all had Eustache Poupin been in the habit of asking for a margin. Hyacinth knew how little indulgence he had ever craved, and this was part of his admiration for the extraordinary Frenchman, an ardent stoic, a cold conspirator, and an exquisite artist, who was by far the most interesting person in the ranks of his acquaintance, and whose conversation in the workshop helped him sometimes to forget the smell of leather and glue. His conversation! Hyacinth had had plenty of that, and had endeared himself to the passionate refugee. Poupin had come to England after the Commune of 1871 to escape the reprisals of the government of M. Thiers, and had remained there in spite of amnesties and rehabilitations by the solemnity and candour of his attention. He was a republican of the old-fashioned sort, of the note of 1848, humanitary and idealistic, infinitely addicted to fraternity and equality, and inexhaustibly surprised and exasperated at finding so little enthusiasm for them in the land of his exile. Poupin had a high claim upon Hyacinth's esteem and gratitude, for he had been his godfather, his protector at the bindery. When Anastasius Vetch found something for Miss Pinson's protégé to do, it was through the Frenchman with whom he had accidentally formed an acquaintance that he found it. When the boy was about 15 years of age, Mr. Vetch made him a present of the Essays of Lord Bacon, and the purchase of this volume had important consequences for Hyacinth. Anastasius Vetch was a poor man, and the luxury of giving was for the most part denied him; but when once in a way he tasted it, he liked the sensation to be pure. No man knew better the difference between the common and the rare, or was more capable of appreciating a book which opened well, of which the margin was not hideously chopped, and of which the lettering on the back was sharp. It was only such a book that he could bring himself to offer even to a poor little devil whom a fifth-rate dressmaker (he knew Pinny was fifth-rate) had rescued from the workhouse. So when it became a question of fitting the great Elizabethan with a new coat, a coat of full morocco, discreetly, delicately gilt, he went with his little cloth-bound volume, a Pickering, straight to Mr. Crookenden, whom every one that knew anything about the matter knew to be a prince of binders, although they also knew that his work, limited in quantity, was mainly done for a particular bookseller, and only through the latter's agency. Anastasius Vetch had no idea of paying the bookseller's commission, and though he could be lavish, for him, when he made a present, he was capable of taking an immense deal of trouble to save sixpence. He made his way into Mr. Crookenden's workshop, which was situated in a small superannuated square in Soho, and where the proposal of so slender a job was received at first with coldness. Mr. Vetch, however, insisted, and explained with irresistible frankness the motive of his errand, the desire to obtain the best possible binding for the least possible money. He made his conception of the best possible binding so vivid, so exemplary, that the master of the shop at last confessed to that disinterested sympathy which, under favouring circumstances, establishes itself between the artist and the connoisseur. Mr. Vetch's little book was put in hand as a particular service to an eccentric gentleman whose visit had been a smile-stirring interlude, for the circle of listening workmen, in a merely mechanical day, and when he went back, 3 weeks later, to see whether it were done, he had the pleasure of finding that his injunctions, punctually complied with, had even been bettered. The work had been accomplished with a perfection of skill which made him ask whom he was to thank for it (he had been told that one man should do the whole of it), and in this manner he made the acquaintance of the most brilliant craftsman in the establishment, the incorruptible, the imaginative, the unerring Eustache Poupin. In response to an appreciation which he felt not to be banal, M. Poupin remarked that he had at home a small collection of experiments in morocco, Russia, parchment, of fanciful specimens, with which, for the love of the art, he had amused his leisure hours, and to which he should be happy to show his interlocutor if the latter would do him the honour to call upon him at his lodgings in Lisson Grove. Mr. Vetch made a note of the address, and for the love of the art went one Sunday afternoon to see the binder's esoteric studies. On this occasion he made the acquaintance of Madame Poupin, a small fat lady with a bristling moustache, the white cap of an ouvrière, a knowledge of her husband's craft that was equal to his own, and not a syllable of English, save the words "What you think? What you think?" which she introduced with startling frequency. He also discovered that his new acquaintance had been a political proscript, and that he regarded the iniquitous fabric of Church and State with an eye scarcely more reverent than the fiddler's own. M. Poupin was a socialist, which Anastasia Vetch was not, and a constructive democrat instead of being a mere scoffer at effete things, and a theorist and an optimist and a visionary. He believed that the day was to come when all the nations of the earth would abolish their frontiers and armies and customs houses, and embrace on both cheeks and cover up the globe with boulevards radiating from Paris, where the human family would sit in groups at little tables according to their affinities, drinking coffee, not tea par exemple, and listening to the music of the spheres. Mr. Vetch neither prefigured nor desired this organised felicity. He was fond of his cup of tea, and only wanted to see the British Constitution a good deal simplified. He thought it a much overrated system, but his heresies rubbed shoulders sociably with those of the little bookbinder, and his friend in Lisson Grove became for him the type of the intelligent foreigner whose conversation completes our culture. Poupin's humanitary zeal was as unlimited as his English vocabulary was the reverse, and the new friends agreed with each other enough, and not too much, to discuss, which was much better than an unspeakable harmony. On several other Sunday afternoons the fiddler went back to Lisson Grove, and having, at his theatre, as a veteran, a faithful servant, an occasional privilege, he was able to carry thither, one day in the autumn, an order for 2 seats in the second balcony. Madame Poupin and her husband passed a lugubrious evening at the English Comedy, where they didn't understand a word that was spoken, and consoled themselves by gazing at their friend in the orchestra. But this adventure did not arrest the development of a friendship into which, eventually, Amanda Pynsent was drawn. Madame Poupin, among the cold insularies, lacked female society, and Mr. Vetch proposed to his amiable friend in Lomax Place to call upon her. The little dressmaker, who, in the course of her life, had known no Frenchwoman but the unhappy Florentine, so favourable a specimen till she began to go wrong, adopted his suggestion in the hope that she should get a few ideas from a lady whose appearance would doubtless exemplify, as Florentine's originally had done, the fine taste of her nation. But she found the bookbinder and his wife a bewildering mixture of the brilliant and the relaxed, and was haunted long afterwards by the memory of the lady's calico jacket, her uncorseted form, and her carpet slippers. The acquaintance, none the less, was sealed 3 months later by a supper, one Sunday night, in Lisson Grove, to which Mr. Vetch brought his fiddle, at which Amanda presented to her hosts her adoptive son, and which also revealed to her that Madame Poupin could dress a Michaelmas goose if she couldn't dress a fat Frenchwoman. This lady confided to the fiddler that she thought Miss Pynsent exceedingly comme il faut, dans le genre anglais, and neither Amanda nor Hyacinth had ever passed an evening of such splendour. It took its place, in the boy's recollection, beside the visit, years before, to Mr. Vetch's theatre. He drank in the conversation which passed between that gentleman and M. Poupin. M. Poupin showed him his bindings, the most precious trophies of his skill, and it seemed to Hyacinth that on the spot he was initiated into a fascinating mystery. He handled the books for half an hour. Anastasius Vetch watched him without giving any particular sign. When, therefore, presently, Miss Pinsent consulted her friend for the 20th time on the subject of Hyacinth's "career," she spoke as if she were hesitating between the diplomatic service, the army, and the church. The fiddler replied with promptitude, "Make him, if you can, what the Frenchman is." At the mention of a handicraft poor Pinny always looked very solemn; yet when Mr. Vetch asked her if she were prepared to send the boy to one of the universities, or to pay the premium required for his being articled to a solicitor, or to make favour on his behalf with a bank director or a mighty merchant, or yet again to provide him with a comfortable home while he should woo the muse and await the laurels of literature, when, I say, he put the case before her with this cynical, ironical lucidity, she only sighed and said that all the money she had ever saved was £90, which, as he knew perfectly well, it would cost her his acquaintance for evermore to take out of the bank. The fiddler had, in fact, declared to her, in a manner not to be mistaken, that if she should divest herself on the boy's account of the sole nest-egg of her old age, he would wash his hands of her and her affairs. Her standard of success for Hyacinth was vague, save on one point, as regards which she was passionately, fiercely firm. She was perfectly determined he should never go into a small shop. She would rather see him a bricklayer or a costermonger than dedicated to a retail business, tying up candles at a grocer's, or giving change for a shilling across a counter. She would rather, she declared on one occasion, see him articled to a shoemaker or a tailor. A stationer in a neighbouring street had affixed to his window a written notice that he was in want of a smart errand-boy, and Pinny, on hearing of it, had presented Hyacinth to his consideration. The stationer was a dreadful bullying man with a patch over his eye, who seemed to think the boy would be richly remunerated with 3 shillings a week, a contemptible measure, as it seemed to the dressmaker, of his rare abilities and acquirements. His schooling had been desultory, precarious, and it had a certain continuity mainly in his early years, while he was under the care of an old lady who combined with the functions of a pew opener at a neighbouring church the manipulation in the place itself, where she resided with her sister, a monthly nurse, of such pupils as could be spared in their families from the more urgent exercise of holding the baby and fetching the beer. Later, for a twelvemonth, Pinny had paid 5 shillings a week for him at an academy in a genteel part of Islington, where there was an "instructor in foreign languages," a platform for oratory, and a high social standard, but where Hyacinth suffered from the fact that almost all his mates were the sons of dealers in edible articles, pastry cooks, grocers, and fishmongers, and in this capacity subjected him to pangs and ignominious contrasts by bringing to school for their exclusive consumption, or for exchange and barter, various buns, oranges, spices, and marine animals, which the boy, with his hands in his empty pockets and the sense of a savourless home in his heart, was obliged to see devoured without his participation. Miss Pinsent would not have pretended that he was highly educated in the technical sense of the word, but she believed that at 15 he had read almost every book in the world. The limits of his reading were, in fact, only the limits of his opportunity. Mr. Vetch, who talked with him more and more as he grew older, knew this, and lent him every volume he possessed or could pick up for the purpose. Reading was his happiness, and the absence of any direct contact with the library his principal source of discontent, that is, of that part of his discontent which he could speak out. Mr. Vetch knew that he was really clever, and therefore thought it a woeful pity that he could not have furtherance in some liberal walk; but he would have thought it a greater pity still that so bright a lad should be condemned to measure tape or cut slices of cheese. He himself had no influence which he could bring into play, no connection with the great world of capital or the market of labour. That is, he touched these mighty institutions at but one very small point, a point which, such as it was, he kept well in mind. When Pinnie replied to the stationer round the corner, after he had mentioned the terms on which he was prepared to receive applications from errand boys, that thank heaven she hadn't sunk so low as that, so low as to sell her darling into slavery for 3 shillings a week, he felt that she only gave more florid expression to his own sentiment. Of course, if Hyacinth did not begin by carrying parcels, he could not hope to be promoted, through the more refined nimbleness of tying them up, to a position as accountant or bookkeeper, but both the fiddler and his friend, Miss Pinsent indeed only in the last resort, resigned themselves to the forfeiture of this prospect. Mr. Vetch saw clearly that a charming handicraft was a finer thing than a vulgar business, and one day, after his acquaintance with Eustache Poupin had gone a considerable length, he inquired of the Frenchman whether there would be a chance of the lad's obtaining a footing under his own wing in Mr. Crookenden's workshop. There could be no better place for him to acquire a knowledge of the most delightful of the mechanical arts, and to be received into such an establishment, and at the instance of such an artist, would be a real start in life. M. Poupin meditated, and that evening confided his meditations to the companion who reduplicated all his thoughts and understood him better even than he understood himself. The pair had no children, and had felt the defect. Moreover, they had heard from Mr. Vetch the dolorous tale of the boy's entrance into life. He was one of the disinherited, one of the expropriated, one of the exceptionally interesting, and moreover he was one of themselves, a child, as it were, of France, an offshoot of the sacred race. It is not the most authenticated point in this veracious history, but there is strong reason to believe that tears were shed that night in Lisson Grove over poor little Hyacinth Robinson. In a day or two M. Poupin replied to the fiddler that he had now been several years in Mr. Crookenden's employ, that during that time he had done work for him that he would have had bien du mal to get done by another, and had never asked for an indulgence, an allowance, a remission, an augmentation. It was time, if only for the dignity of the thing, he should ask for something, and he would make their little friend the subject of his demand. La société lui doit bien cela, he remarked afterwards, when, Mr. Crookenden proving dryly hospitable, and the arrangement being formally complete, Mr. Vetch thanked him in his kindly, casual, bashful English way. He was paternal when Hyacinth began to occupy a place in the malodorous chambers in Soho. He took him in hand, made him a disciple, the recipient of a precious tradition, discovered in him a susceptibility to philosophic as well as technic truth. He taught him French and socialism, encouraged him to spend his evenings in Lisson Grove, invited him to regard Madame Poupin as a second, or rather as a third mother, and in short made a very considerable mark on the boy's mind. He elicited the latent Gallicism of his nature, and by the time he was 20, Hyacinth, who had completely assimilated his influence, regarded him with a mixture of veneration and amusement. M. Poupin was the person who consoled him most when he was miserable, and he was very often miserable. His staying away from his work was so rare that in the afternoon before he went home, Hyacinth walked to Lisson Grove to see what ailed him. He found his friend in bed, with a plaster on his chest, and Madame Poupin making tisane over the fire. The Frenchman took his indisposition solemnly but resignedly, like a man who believed that all illness was owing to the imperfect organization of society, and lay, covered up to his chin, with a red cotton handkerchief bound round his head. Near his bed sat a visitor, a young man unknown to Hyacinth. Hyacinth, naturally, had never been to Paris, but he always supposed that the intérieur of his friends in Lisson Grove gave rather a vivid idea of that city. The two small rooms which constituted their establishment contained a great many mirrors, as well as little portraits, old-fashioned prints, of revolutionary heroes. The chimney-piece in the bedroom was muffled in some red drapery, which appeared to Hyacinth extraordinarily magnificent. The principal ornament of the salon was a group of small and highly decorated cups on a tray, accompanied by gilt bottles and glasses, the latter still more diminutive, the whole intended for black coffee and liqueur. There was no carpet on the floor, but rugs and mats of various shapes and sizes disposed themselves at the feet of the chairs and sofas; and in the sitting-room, where there was a wonderful gilt clock of the Empire, surmounted with a subject represented Virtue receiving a crown of laurel from the hands of Faith, Madame Poupin, with the aid of a tiny stove, a handful of charcoal, and 2 or 3 saucepans, carried on a triumphant cuisine. In the windows were curtains of white muslin, much fluted and frilled, and tied with pink ribbon. Chapter 7